During the pandemic, when I was in some dark moments, I'd watch like these 5-minute YouTube videos of Viktor Frankl talking, and suddenly I felt enthusiastic about life. And yet, if you take Viktor Frankl's core message of empowerment, which I think is the Larry Elder message, that you were describing as well, which is that you can change your life, you can take control and responsibility of your life. But somehow progressives said that's fine for self-help, but in politics, it's blaming the victim. To suggest that people have control over their lives, to suggest that people have responsibility and agency and empowerment was viewed as blaming the victim. And boy, what a disservice and what a destructive view, this idea that you should categorize people as victims and suggest they're powerless.
It seems to me that if you have this sort of secular idea on steroids, this, government's going to do everything on steroids, it leads to this sort of crazy neuroticism because government can't solve all of your problems and you're constantly looking to it as you would God or whatever it is that you believe in. I'm wondering if that tracks with where you're at sort of politically too, because I've seen a bunch of my liberal friends that are on a similar trajectory as me that now are either believers that weren't believers or are at least questioning or something along those lines.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I think that I want to distinguish between the progressive activists who have the victim ideology and control policy to some extent, a large extent at the state level in terms of Housing First, ACLU, those folks. I want to distinguish from them and, say my hairdresser who voted for Bernie Sanders, who also is upset about the homeless situation, the open drug scenes. She's more in that 70 to 80% that I think would favor a more balanced response of both carrots and sticks in terms of a shelter first, treatment first approach rather than a housing first approach. So I think the challenge, again, I think there is a leadership problem. I mean, you need to have somebody who can articulate that vision and explain it to people. Because, when you get people in a conversation like a focus group rather than in like if you're using type 2 thinking, slow thinking rather than fast thinking, I think people are more attentive to the need for a balance, that you shouldn't just be able to, we still have a very deep reciprocity, motivation, which is that if you give somebody something, you should expect something in return. Progressives are violating that in this idea of you just giving street addicts anything they want and not asking for public order and public behavior in return. So that seems to me, that's the soft underbelly of the progressive agenda in California. Honestly, I think it's the soft underbelly of Democrats nationwide. I think Republicans should be doing a lot more with it, which is that, here this big package, this big budget package is going to give a couple more years of college education, some child care credits. But what's it doing about like the most important cause of death, accidental cause of death? I mean, here the FDA finally issued a one pill can kill advisory. But I mean, like we're seeing, kids who experiment with thinking they're taking a half a Percocet, buying it from a dealer on Snapchat, are dying in their bedrooms, being found by their parents. I mean, this is Michael K. Williams, the great actor from The Wire, who died from fentanyl poisoning. Prince, Tom Petty. I mean, fentanyl changes everything in terms of this is not just an addiction problem. We're now dealing with active poisoning, and Democrats are just not to be found anywhere in dealing with this. So I do think there is room for maneuver. I do think it's a dark moment right now, but there's so much chaos in the system. I think the last 4 years we've seen that something is going to change, that the system can't maintain its instability for many more years. I think Republicans are moving in a lot of the issues that you and I think probably had concerns with Republicans over 10 or 20 years ago are just not issues anymore. I see the progress that's, like one of the characters in my book is Harvey Milk, the gay rights leader. I asked my publisher, I was like, are my conservative readers going to have a problem with Harvey Milk? And he was like, no. I mean, it's like that issue's gone. So a lot of the social issues seem to be moving to the background, and we see new issues coming to the forefront that I do think open up possibilities for some challenge to progressive orthodoxy.
It's interesting, as you were mentioning that, I may have told you this story 3 years ago, but when I had interviewed David Horowitz the first time, and David Horowitz was sort of the original Why I Left the Left guy, he told a story about how, he was a Marxist his whole life, a leftist, his parents were communists, and then in 1984 he liked Reagan during the re-election, so he says, basically I'm leaving the left. And then he told me this story about how in New York, at the peak of the AIDS crisis, that all of the public health officials, who basically, they were lefties, it was run by mostly Democrats, that they all knew that it was emanating from the gay bathhouses. Like, they just knew people were doing drugs there, they were having unprotected sex, and they knew it was all coming from there. And they knew that all of these people, young people, were dying every day. Hundreds and thousands were dying. And that the conservatives, who had really no power, the Republicans in New York City, came in and said, well, okay, we got to close the bathhouses. That's how we have to do something here. And it was the Democrats who said no, because they didn't want to infringe on, on those people's lifestyle to be thought, and they called them homophobes, basically. Anyway, I'm just reminded of that because it's so consistent with everything that you're saying here.
Yeah, because they were the victimization or the spread of HIV/AIDS was occurring at the individual level rather than something being imposed by the system. And so, yeah, I think that you have to remember progressives start from the point of view that the system is evil, and it's basically a Rousseauian idea that the individual is innocent and good and that the society is what's corrupting. And conservatives, just to really dumb it down to kind of big crayon level, and conservatives are more like humans are fallen and society is what keeps us on the straight and narrow. And I think that's still very much alive here. It's why we allow people to be killed by drug dealers, killed by civilians, but we, are, just everything changes when people are perceived as being victimized by the state. Right.
Like literally, if you bring up black on black crime, they'll tell you you're a racist. I mean, that's your point.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, here's the interesting thing, and I'm interested in hearing your view of it too. I mean, to declare all black people victims, that's totally racist. And the idea that all white people are privileged is also racist. And when you really kind of listen to it for a minute, you go, so let me get this straight. You're saying that all white people are privileged and all black people are victims, and that you think that's not racist? It's the most racist thing. Victimology is actually bigger than that, of course. It encompasses that kind of racism, but it also suggests that a whole set of other people are basically, that people are powerless, that people that you put in the category of victims are powerless. And therefore, and then one of the consequences, of course, is that we shouldn't do anything to prevent them from being victimized, because doing so would only exacerbate the victimization. Sorry, go ahead.
No, well, you know my feelings on this, but I'll tell you this. Look, I have Larry Elder coming to my house for dinner tonight. Larry Elder, born in South Central, dad was a janitor, does not view himself as a victim and is not a victim. And I have one of my best friends from childhood whose son right now, who's white, which doesn't matter other than for the purposes of this story, his son is hooked on fentanyl right now. And he, and it's like he grew up privileged and that his dad had a job. So It's like none of this makes any sense.
I'll give you, I'll tell you something. I've been obsessed with this, with one of the fathers of cognitive behavioral therapy named Viktor Frankl, who is famous because he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. He's one of the original humanistic psychologists of the 1960s. His whole book, Man's Search for Meaning, is about how he survived the concentration camps under the Nazis. And he did so by changing his mentality and getting a goal. And his goal was, survive the concentration camps, find my wife and parents, and write a book about the experience. And so his whole thing was mentality. Forget about how bad the situation is. Mentality is everything. And he was loved by progressives in the 60s. Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, sold like 10 million copies. It's this during the pandemic, when I was in some dark moments, I'd watch like these 5-minute YouTube videos of Viktor Frankl talking. And suddenly I felt enthusiastic about life. And yet, if you take Viktor Frankl's core message of empowerment, which I think is the Larry Elder message, that you were describing as well, which is that you can change your life, you can take control and responsibility of your life. But somehow progressives said that's fine for self-help, but in politics, it's blaming the victim. To suggest that people have control over their lives, to suggest that people have responsibility and agency and empowerment was viewed as blaming the victim. And boy, what a disservice. And what a destructive view, this idea that you should categorize people as victims and suggest they're powerless.
Well, that's why I always say it's anti-human, actually, because the one thing that separates us from the animals is our ability to logic and reason and dream and pursue and have passion for something and build. That was a lot of things that I combined into one thing, but that's the thing. That's the thing, and they're saying, no, it's not yours. It's ours to somehow give to you.
And that seems to me, in terms of fighting back against the radical left and the dehumanization that you're describing and the disempowerment, that seems to me to be the soft underbelly as well. We I think, have a natural instinct to not want to perceive ourselves as victims. In fact, in the book, I describe a fair amount of homeless guys will confess that they were just playing the victim. That they don't actually perceive them. Homeless guys living on the streets don't actually perceive themselves as victims. And I think in part because it's like, that's a terrible way to live. It's a depressive way to live, and it's hard to sustain it. They might pretend that for a bit, but I think that really you're on to something really powerful here, which is, and I think that, all of your work, honestly, Dave, has been really creative and productive when you're talking about this question of psychological health, that the extension of psychological health in one's own life in politics should be one of empowerment. I don't think that means that, I think when it comes to things like healthcare, that we still may need a universal psychiatric program, but it has to be paired with this idea that people are capable of taking responsibility for their lives. Even people, frankly, with disabilities and addictions and in all sorts of terrible circumstances, all the more reason that they should be empowered to take power and responsibility for their lives.
If you're looking for more honest and thoughtful conversations about politics instead of nonstop yelling, check out our politics playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, watch our full episode playlist all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.